after everything I suffered for you, Amaka. This is how you pay me back. Stop acting like you're perfect. I was tired of living in your shadow. My shadow, I dropped out of school for you. I starved for you. And I never asked you to do all that. You didn't ask me. You were 6 years old when I became your responsibility. Well, maybe I got tired of being the poor little sister everybody pitied. So you slept with my husband inside my own house? He loved me too. Shut up! Why can't you accept that somebody finally chose me over you? You didn't steal my husband, Amaka. You buried the only family I had left. He chose me and destroyed me.
The peaceful town of Nsukka was quiet that evening as dark clouds slowly gathered in the sky. Inside a small but neat family house near the edge of the town, 20-year-old Ngozi Okafor sat on an old wooden chair reading one of her university books while her little 6-year-old sister Amaka played with a broken doll on the floor. Their mother and father had traveled earlier that morning for a family burial ceremony in another village and promised they would return before nightfall. Amaka suddenly looked up at Ngozi and smiled innocently. "Sister Ngozi, will Daddy bring biscuits for me?" she asked happily. Ngozi laughed softly and touched her little sister's cheek. "You know Daddy never forgets you," she replied gently, "and Mommy too." Amaka smiled proudly and continued playing while Ngozi stared toward the window thoughtfully. Deep inside her, she felt slightly uneasy without understanding why. The night slowly became darker as rain began falling heavily outside. Hours passed, but their parents still did not return home. Around midnight, loud knocking suddenly echoed through the compound gate. Ngozi quickly stood up with fear already growing inside her chest. When she opened the door, she saw two men standing under the rain with serious faces. One of them removed his cap slowly and sighed deeply. "Ngozi," he said quietly, "there has been an accident." At that moment, Ngozi's body went cold immediately. Little Amaka ran toward the door confused. "Where is Mommy?" she asked softly. Nobody answered her at first. The older man lowered his eyes sadly. "The vehicle carrying your parents lost control near Opi Junction," he explained carefully. "We are very sorry." The words hit Ngozi like a violent storm. "No," she whispered weakly. "No, no." Her legs suddenly gave way beneath her as she collapsed to the ground, crying uncontrollably. Amaka became frightened and began crying too, without fully understanding what had happened. "Where is my mommy?" she kept asking repeatedly while shaking Ngozi's shoulder. "Where is Daddy?" That night became the beginning of darkness in Ngozi's life. The following days were filled with tears, burial preparations, mourners, and endless crying. Their small family house became crowded with relatives pretending to care. Women cried loudly during the burial, while men shook their heads sadly discussing the tragedy. Through it all, little Amaka stayed close to Ngozi like a shadow, frightened and confused by everything happening around her. During the burial ceremony, Amaka suddenly pulled Ngozi's wrapper softly and whispered, "When will Mommy wake up?" Ngozi almost broke apart completely hearing those words. She knelt down and hugged her tightly while tears rolled down her face. "Mommy has gone to be with God," she whispered painfully, "but I am here with you." After the burial ended, the atmosphere slowly changed. The same relatives who acted caring began discussing the sisters like burdens nobody wanted. One evening, Ngozi overheard some elderly relatives talking outside. "How can this young girl train a child alone?" one woman asked. "It is impossible." Another man sighed deeply. "The younger one should go to Lagos and work as a housemaid. At least she will eat there." Ngozi froze immediately after hearing those words. Anger rose inside her chest like fire. She walked toward them boldly, despite her grief. "Nobody is taking my sister anywhere," she said firmly. The relatives looked shocked. One elderly aunt clicked her tongue. "Ngozi, be realistic," she said coldly. "You are only 20 years old. How will you survive? University alone is already difficult." Ngozi's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. "I don't care how hard it becomes. She is my sister. We will stay together." The relatives shook their heads disapprovingly, but Ngozi refused to change her mind. A few days later, after everyone had left, the house suddenly became painfully empty and silent. For the first time, reality truly entered Ngozi's heart. Their parents were gone forever. That evening, Ngozi took Amaka to the cemetery quietly. The sky looked grey and lifeless as they stood before the fresh graves. Little Amaka held Ngozi's hand tightly. Ngozi stared at the graves with swollen eyes and trembling lips. "Mommy, Daddy, I don't know how to do this, but I promise I will not abandon Amaka. I will take care of her, no matter what happens." Tears rolled heavily down her face as little Amaka hugged her waist silently. After that day, Ngozi stopped being just a sister. She became a mother overnight. A few weeks later, she made the painful decision to leave university because there was no money left. Her lecturers tried encouraging her to continue, but Ngozi already knew survival had become more important than dreams. She began struggling daily to feed herself and Amaka. Every morning before sunrise, Ngozi fried akara by the roadside while smoke entered her eyes. Afterwards, she carried vegetables in a basin around the market under the hot sun. Sometimes customers insulted her or priced her goods unfairly, but she swallowed the pain quietly because of Amaka. At night, after Amaka had slept, Ngozi closed her small market store after another difficult day. Amaka had already fallen asleep from tiredness. With no transport money, Ngozi carried her sleeping sister gently onto her back and began walking home through the rain. Her clothes became completely soaked while muddy water touched her feet, but she continued walking slowly through the empty road. Amaka slept peacefully against her back without knowing the weight her sister carried every single day. Ngozi adjusted her carefully and whispered softly through tears mixing with the rain, "No matter how hard life becomes, I will protect you. I will never leave you alone." The years passed slowly inside the small town of Nsukka, but life never became easier for Ngozi Okafor. Every morning, before the first cock crowed, she woke up quietly from the thin mattress she shared with her younger sister, tied her wrapper firmly around her waist, and hurried outside to begin frying akara beside the roadside while the cold morning air touched her tired skin. Her hands became rough from hard work, and dark circles slowly formed under her eyes from stress and sleepless nights. But she never complained openly because everything she did was for Amaka. Little by little, Amaka grew from a frightened child into a beautiful and intelligent young girl who loved her sister deeply. Everywhere she went, she proudly called Ngozi Sister Mama, and people in the neighborhood often shook their heads in pity whenever they saw how much Ngozi sacrificed for her. Some women admired her strength, but others mocked her quietly behind her back. One afternoon at the market, while Ngozi arranged tomatoes inside her small tray, two women standing nearby began gossiping carelessly. "That girl has suffered too much," one woman said. "See how she wasted her youth because of another person's child." The other woman laughed lightly. "No man wants responsibility these days. She should have married when she still had beauty." Ngozi heard every word clearly, but she pretended not to notice while forcing herself to smile at customers. Deep inside, however, the words pierced her painfully because she knew they were partly true. Before her parents died, many young men admired her beauty and intelligence, but now most of them avoided her because of the burden she carried. Some men even insulted her openly. One evening, a man who once tried to date her saw her carrying heavy basins through the market and laughed mockingly. "Ngozi," he called out loudly, "you turned yourself into an old woman before your time." His friends laughed, while Ngozi quietly lowered her eyes and continued walking. That night, when she returned home exhausted, Amaka noticed her silence immediately. "Sister Mama, are you alright?" she asked softly, while helping arrange vegetables inside the room. Ngozi forced a smile. "I am fine," she lied gently. "I am just tired." But despite all the insults and suffering, Ngozi continued fighting for Amaka's future with all her strength. She attended every school meeting pretending to be Amaka's mother because she did not want her sister to feel different from other children. During one PTA meeting, a teacher smiled warmly at Ngozi and said, "Your daughter is very brilliant." Ngozi paused briefly after hearing the word daughter, then smiled proudly. "Thank you," she replied softly. "She works very hard." Every night after returning from work, even when her body ached terribly, Ngozi still washed Amaka's school uniforms carefully by hand under dim lantern light while Amaka slept peacefully nearby. Sometimes her fingers hurt so much she almost cried, but once she looked at her sleeping sister, she continued quietly. Many nights, there was not enough food for both of them. Whenever that happened, Ngozi always lied. "I already ate at the market," she would say, while pushing the food toward Amaka. Innocent young Amaka believed her for years, not knowing her sister often went to bed hungry, just to keep her fed. As Amaka entered her teenage years, her love and admiration for Ngozi grew even stronger. She became serious with her studies because she wanted to change their lives one day. Sometimes she hugged Ngozi tightly and said, "Don't worry, Sister Mama. When I become successful, I will take care of you forever." Those words gave Ngozi strength during her darkest moments. But life kept testing her in painful ways. After years of struggling with unpaid rent, their landlord finally lost patience. One hot afternoon, the man arrived angrily at their compound while Ngozi was returning from the market. "Ngozi," he shouted loudly before she even entered the room, "I cannot continue like this anymore. I have given you enough time." Ngozi immediately began begging him softly, "Please give me a little more time. I will pay something soon." But the landlord shook his head firmly. "No more stories," he replied harshly. "You must leave this room by the end of the week." Amaka stood silently behind Ngozi with tears already filling her eyes. That night, the sisters packed their few belongings quietly into old bags and moved into a much smaller room near a noisy street. The room leaked whenever rain fell, and there was barely enough space for both of them. But Ngozi still tried to make it feel like home. "It is only temporary," she told Amaka encouragingly while arranging their things. "One day we will laugh about all this." However, the stress slowly began to affect Ngozi's health badly. She became thinner and weaker from overworking herself daily. One hot afternoon, while selling vegetables under the hot sun, she suddenly became dizzy and collapsed briefly beside her stall. Concerned traders rushed towards her immediately. "Ngozi, you need to rest before this work kills you." But after drinking water and resting briefly, Ngozi still stood up again. "I cannot stop. Amaka still needs me." Even when sickness entered her body, she refused to give up. One emotional night, heavy rain fell outside while Amaka pretended to sleep quietly on their mattress. Ngozi knelt beside the bed with tears running down her face as she prayed softly in the darkness, not knowing Amaka was awake, listening carefully. "God," Ngozi whispered painfully, "please help me. Don't let me fail this child. I may not be her real mother, but please give me strength to raise her well. Don't let her suffer because of me." Her voice broke completely as she covered her face and cried silently. On the mattress, Amaka's own eyes filled with tears after hearing those words. For the first time, she fully understood how much Ngozi carried alone every single day. Quietly, without making a sound, she turned toward the wall and cried too. Years continued passing slowly until finally the day that Ngozi had prayed for arrived. Amaka graduated successfully from secondary school as one of the best students in her class. The school compound was filled with proud parents celebrating happily while music played loudly in the background. Ngozi sat quietly among the crowd wearing her best old wrapper and holding back emotional tears. When Amaka's name was announced proudly on stage, the young girl searched through the crowd until she saw Ngozi smiling proudly at her. Their eyes met and Amaka immediately began crying emotionally before receiving her certificate. After the ceremony ended, she ran into Ngozi's arms tightly. "Sister Mama," she whispered through tears, "this is because of you." Ngozi hugged her strongly while tears rolled down her own cheeks. "No," she replied softly, "you did this yourself. I am proud of you." And as they stood there holding each other tightly while the noisy celebration continued around them, Ngozi felt for the first time in many years that maybe all her sacrifices had not been in vain after all. Life slowly began changing for Ngozi Okafor and her younger sister Amaka after Amaka graduated secondary school successfully in Nsukka. For the first time in many years, hope entered their tiny room again. Every evening after work, Ngozi and Amaka sat together discussing the future excitedly. Amaka dreamed of attending university and becoming successful enough to change both their lives forever. Ngozi listened proudly each time her sister spoke about becoming an educated woman with a good career. One hot afternoon, Amaka rushed into the room holding a brown envelope tightly against her chest while breathing heavily from excitement. "Sister Amaka!" she screamed happily before even entering properly. "I got admission!" Ngozi immediately dropped the basin she was washing and grabbed the letter with trembling hands. As she read the admission details from the university in Enugu, tears quickly filled her eyes. "Thank you, Jesus," she whispered emotionally before hugging Amaka tightly. Both sisters cried and laughed together inside the small room like people who had finally escaped years of darkness. That evening, Ngozi bought soft drinks and meat pie for celebration, despite barely having enough money left. "This is only the beginning," she told Amaka proudly. "Your life will become better than mine." But the excitement slowly met reality when Ngozi saw the total amount needed for school fees, hostel fees, books, and transportation. The amount looked impossible for someone already struggling daily to survive. That night, after Amaka had slept, Ngozi sat alone staring at the paper silently while fear slowly entered her chest. She knew she could not disappoint Amaka after all the sacrifices they had already made together. The next morning, Ngozi began fighting another battle. She borrowed money from traders at the market, joined small contribution groups, and even started cleaning a restaurant at night after selling vegetables during the day. Her body became weaker from overworking herself, but she refused to stop. Sometimes she returned home so exhausted that she slept sitting down without eating. Yet, each time Amaka apologized for being a burden, Ngozi immediately stopped her. "Never say that again," she said firmly one evening while arranging old clothes into a bag for Amaka to take to school. "You are not a burden. You are my future." Finally, the day came for Amaka to leave for university in Enugu. Ngozi followed her to campus carrying old bags and a small food flask because they could not afford expensive things like other students arriving with cars and rich parents. As they entered the busy school environment, Amaka's eyes widened with amazement. Everywhere looked beautiful and modern to her. Students wore expensive clothes, carried smartphones, and spoke confidently about vacations, businesses, and luxury lifestyles. For the first time in her life, Amaka truly saw the huge difference between her poor background and the world of wealthy young people. Ngozi noticed her staring around nervously and squeezed her hand gently. "Focus on your studies," she advised softly. "One day, your life will change too." At first, Amaka remained humble and grateful. She called Ngozi every evening after lectures and shared every little experience happily. "Sister Amaka, my lecturer praised my answer today," she would say excitedly over the phone. Ngozi listened proudly while smiling through her exhaustion. But as weeks turned to months, the environment around Amaka slowly began affecting her mind. She became close friends with flashy girls named Cynthia, Vanessa, and Ella, students from rich families who lived luxurious lifestyles completely different from hers. They wore expensive perfumes, traveled during holidays, and constantly mocked struggling people openly. One afternoon, while sitting together at a campus restaurant, Cynthia laughed loudly after hearing about a woman who sold food to train her children. "God forbid suffering," she said mockingly. "I cannot kill myself for anybody like these poor village women." Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. "That is why girls should marry rich men and stop suffering unnecessarily." The girls laughed while Amaka forced herself to laugh too, even though the words reminded her painfully of Ngozi. Slowly, Amaka began hiding details about her background from her new friends. Whenever they asked about her family, she answered vaguely to avoid embarrassment. She also became more conscious about her clothes and appearance because many students looked far richer and more sophisticated than her. One day, she overheard two girls whispering after seeing Ngozi's old handbag during a campus visit. One girl said carelessly, "That woman looks like somebody's village auntie." Though Amaka pretended not to hear, shame quietly entered her heart for the first time. Meanwhile, back in Nsukka, Ngozi continued suffering silently to keep Amaka in school. Her debts increased daily, and she often skipped meals completely to save transport money for Amaka. The stress slowly damaged her health badly. She developed constant headaches and severe body pain, but whenever neighbors advised her to rest, she always gave the same answer: "I will rest after Amaka graduates." One evening at the market, Ngozi became so weak from hunger that she nearly fainted while attending to customers. Mama Udwak, an elderly woman nearby, held her arm quickly. "Ngozi, this suffering is too much," the woman said worriedly. "You cannot continue destroying yourself like this." Ngozi smiled weakly. "It is temporary," she replied softly. "Once Amaka finishes school, everything will become better." Months later, Ngozi decided to surprise Amaka with an unexpected campus visit after saving small money to buy foodstuff and toiletries for her. She traveled early in the morning and finally arrived tired but excited. But the moment Amaka saw her standing near the hostel gate with heavy bags, something inside her became uncomfortable. Some of her rich friends were nearby watching. Instead of running joyfully into Ngozi's arms like before, Amaka walked towards her slowly and nervously. "Sister Amaka, you should have called first," she said quietly. Ngozi's smile faded slightly after noticing the strange tone, but she ignored it immediately. "I wanted to surprise you," she replied warmly. As they walked around campus together, Ngozi noticed Amaka had changed in small ways. She spoke differently, dressed differently, and looked constantly worried about who was watching them. During lunch, one of Ngozi's rich friends approached their table briefly. After introducing herself politely, the girl glanced at Ngozi's simple wrapper and worn sandals before leaving. Amaka looked embarrassed immediately afterwards. Ngozi noticed the discomfort clearly, but pretended not to understand because love refused to see her sister badly. Before leaving, Ngozi pressed some folded money secretly into Amaka's hand. "Manage this small one," she said gently, despite knowing it was almost all the money she had left. Amaka stared at the money silently with guilt inside her chest. That night, after returning to Nsukka, Ngozi sat alone inside their dark room during a power outage. Sweat covered her tired face as she used a small hand fan slowly. Outside, neighbors chatted noisily while generators sounded in richer compounds nearby. But inside the darkness, Ngozi smiled proudly while staring at glamorous pictures Amaka had posted online from campus parties and outings with her new friends. Though the pictures showed a world far away from her own suffering, Ngozi's heart still filled with happiness because she believed her sister was finally living the beautiful life they both had dreamed about together. Life continued moving slowly for Ngozi Okafor inside Nsukka, but the stress of survival had already become part of her body and soul. Every day looked almost the same. She woke before sunrise, worked until her legs hurt badly, and returned home exhausted while pretending everything was all right for Amaka's sake. Though Amaka was doing well in university in Enugu, the financial pressure on Ngozi only increased. Sometimes she sat alone at night calculating debts with trembling hands while wondering how much longer her body could continue enduring such suffering. One hot afternoon, Ngozi traveled to Enugu markets to buy cheaper goods in bulk for resale. The market was crowded and noisy as traders shouted prices from every direction while buses honked loudly outside. Ngozi balanced a heavy bag on her head while struggling through the crowd under the scorching sun. Suddenly, someone accidentally pushed her hard from behind. She lost balance immediately and the basin of tomatoes she carried fell violently onto the dirty ground, scattering everywhere. "Jesus!" Ngozi cried out in panic as people stepped carelessly on some of the tomatoes. She quickly knelt down trying to gather them while fighting tears of frustration. Some people simply walked past without caring, while others stared briefly before moving on. Then a calm male voice suddenly spoke behind her. "Please, everybody move back a little." Ngozi looked up and saw a tall, handsome man in a neat shirt bending down to help her pick the scattered tomatoes carefully. He looked older than her, maybe in his 40s, with a calm face and kind eyes that carried unusual gentleness. "Thank you," Ngozi said softly, while trying to avoid eye contact from embarrassment. The man smiled lightly. "It is all right," he replied calmly. "Anybody could have fallen." After helping her gather everything, he noticed how tired and stressed she looked. "Are you okay?" he asked genuinely. Ngozi forced a smile quickly. "I am fine," she answered automatically, the same way she always answered everybody. But the man looked unconvinced. "You do not look fine," he said honestly. For some reason, his voice carried concern instead of mockery, and that alone surprised Ngozi deeply, because most people only notice her struggles to pity or insult her. Before leaving, the man introduced himself politely. "My name is Emeka Daniels. I own an electronics business in Lagos, but I come to Enugu often for supplies." Ngozi nodded quietly. "I am Ngozi." Emeka smiled warmly. "It was nice meeting you, Ngozi." After that day, Ngozi expected never to see him again, but life surprised her unexpectedly. A few days later, Emeka visited the same market again and found Ngozi selling vegetables quietly under a faded umbrella. He greeted her warmly like an old friend. "So, this is where you work every day?" he asked while looking around. Ngozi laughed softly. "Yes, this market is almost my second home." Instead of looking down on her, Emeka sat beside her comfortably and began talking with her kindly. He asked about her life, her family, and her dreams. At first, Ngozi answered carefully because she was used to people judging her after hearing her story. But to her surprise, Emeka listened quietly with respect instead of mockery. When she finally explained how she sacrificed her education to raise Amaka after their parents died, Emeka became silent for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly in admiration. "You are a strong woman," he said softly. "Not everybody can do what you did." Those simple words touched Ngozi deeply because it had been years since anyone looked at her with admiration instead of sympathy. As weeks passed, Emeka continued visiting her often whenever he traveled to Enugu. Sometimes he bought food for her at the market, other times he simply sat nearby talking with her during quiet hours. Slowly, Ngozi began smiling more naturally again. For the first time in many years, she started feeling like a woman instead of only a struggling caregiver. One evening after work, Emeka insisted on taking her to a small restaurant. Ngozi felt nervous and uncomfortable because she was not used to such treatment anymore. As they sat together eating quietly, Emeka noticed she barely touched her food. "Why are you not eating?" he asked gently. Ngozi smiled awkwardly. "I am not used to all this," she admitted honestly. Emeka stared at her for a moment before speaking softly. "Ngozi, you deserve kindness too." Those words almost brought tears into her eyes immediately. Slowly, Emeka began helping her financially without making her feel ashamed. He paid some of Amaka's outstanding school fees secretly after hearing about her struggles. He also encouraged Ngozi to reduce her workload and rest more often. "Your body is not a machine," he warned one afternoon after noticing how tired she looked. "If you collapse, who will take care of you?" Even Amaka became excited after meeting Emeka properly for the first time during one of her visits home from school. She immediately noticed how differently he treated Ngozi compared to other men. Instead of disrespecting or pitying her, he valued her deeply. One evening while helping Ngozi cook, Amaka whispered happily and said, "Sister Mama, I like him." Ngozi laughed shyly like a young girl again. "Amaka, stop teasing me," she replied while blushing lightly. But deep inside, hope had already started growing quietly inside her heart. Months passed, and Emeka's presence slowly transformed Ngozi's life emotionally. She began dressing more carefully again and smiling more often. Neighbors even started noticing the change. Mama Odwak laughed one day after seeing Ngozi glowing differently. "Love has finally remembered you," the old woman teased playfully. Ngozi laughed shyly while shaking her head, but her heart secretly felt warm. Then one unforgettable evening, Emeka invited Ngozi, Amaka, and a few close friends to dinner at a beautiful restaurant in Enugu. Ngozi assumed it was an ordinary outing and spent most of the evening laughing nervously while Amaka teased her happily. Suddenly, Emeka stood up quietly and asked everybody for attention. The room became silent immediately. Ngozi looked confused as Emeka walked towards her slowly with emotional seriousness in his eyes. Then, to her complete shock, he knelt down in front of everybody holding a small ring box. Tears immediately filled Ngozi's eyes before he even spoke. "Ngozi Okafor, you spent most of your life loving and sacrificing for other people. I know life has not been fair to you, but I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that you deserve happiness too. Will you marry me?" Ngozi completely broke down crying. Her hands covered her mouth as years of pain, loneliness, and silent suffering suddenly crashed out of her heart at once. Amaka also began crying emotionally beside her as their friends clapped happily. Through trembling tears, Ngozi nodded repeatedly. "Yes," she whispered painfully. "Yes." Emeka gently placed the ring on her finger while the restaurant erupted with applause and celebration around them. That night, after returning home, Ngozi sat quietly by the old photograph of her late parents inside their room. Tears rolled softly down her cheeks as she held the engagement ring carefully in her hand. "Mommy, Daddy," she whispered emotionally while staring at the photograph. "After everything, maybe happiness has finally found me too." Then she closed her eyes thankfully, believing with all her heart that the years of suffering were finally coming to an end. The news of Ngozi Okafor's engagement spread quickly across Nsukka, and many people could hardly believe it. Women at the market discussed it excitedly every morning while arranging their goods. Some shook their heads in surprise because after all the years of suffering, they never imagined Ngozi would finally find happiness with a successful man like Emeka Daniels. Even the people who once mocked her quietly began speaking differently. "God has remembered Ngozi at last," Mama Oduak said proudly one afternoon while smiling at her. For the first time in many years, Ngozi herself slowly started believing it too. Wedding preparations began quietly but joyfully. Since Ngozi hated unnecessary showiness, she wanted a simple ceremony with only close friends, neighbors, church members, and a few relatives. Emeka agreed immediately because what mattered most to him was seeing her happy. Every evening after work, Ngozi and Amaka sat together discussing wedding plans inside their room while laughing like best friends again. Amaka became fully involved in everything. She helped choose fabrics, shoes, decorations, and hairstyles excitedly. Sometimes she stared at Ngozi smiling happily and said, "Sister Mama, I still cannot believe you're finally getting married." Ngozi laughed shyly like a young girl. "Even me, I still feel like I am dreaming," she admitted softly. Meanwhile, Emeka continued treating both sisters with unusual kindness and respect. He often visited with gifts and groceries, and he insisted that Amaka should never lack anything while still in school. One evening, while they all ate dinner together, Emeka looked at Amaka seriously and said, "You are lucky to have a sister like Ngozi. Not everybody can sacrifice their whole life for another person." Amaka smiled proudly immediately. "I know," she replied softly. "She is not just my sister, she is my mother too." Those words touched Ngozi deeply. As the wedding day approached, Ngozi became emotional more often. Sometimes she sat quietly staring at her engagement ring while remembering all the painful years she survived alone. One night, she brought out her parents' old photograph and cried softly while speaking to it. "I wish both of you were alive to see this day," she whispered painfully. "I survived because of the promises I made beside your graves." Finally, the wedding day arrived beautifully. The church in Nsukka was decorated with flowers and white ribbons, while soft music played quietly in the background. Ngozi wore a simple but elegant white gown that made her look younger and more beautiful than people remembered. Many guests became emotional the moment they saw her walking slowly into the church because everybody knew her painful story already. Some women even wiped tears from their eyes during the ceremony. As Ngozi walked toward the altar holding Amaka's hand tightly, memories of her years of suffering flooded her heart all at once. She remembered carrying Amaka through heavy rain, starving to feed her, washing clothes late at night, and praying desperately for survival. Now, suddenly, she stood inside a beautiful church as a bride. It almost felt unreal. Emeka stared at her with admiration and deep love throughout the ceremony. During the exchange of vows, Ngozi's voice trembled badly from emotion. "I never thought happiness would find me again," she confessed softly while crying. Emeka held her hands gently. "You deserve every good thing life can give," he replied quietly. Many guests cried openly after hearing those words. After the church service ended, everyone moved to a small reception hall nearby for celebration. Music played joyfully while guests danced, laughed, and ate happily together. But the most emotional moment came during the speeches. When Amaka stood up holding the microphone, the hall slowly became quiet. At first, she smiled nervously while staring at Ngozi seated beside Emeka. Then, tears suddenly filled her eyes. "People keep calling Ngozi my sister, but honestly, she's more than that to me." The hall became completely silent. Amaka wiped tears from her cheeks before continuing. When our parents died, I was only a child. I did not understand what was happening. But this woman standing there, she pointed toward Ngozi emotionally, she became my mother overnight. She stopped her own dreams so I could still have mine. She starved so I could eat. She suffered so I could smile. Everything good in my life today is because of her. By now, many guests were openly crying. Ngozi herself covered her mouth while tears flowed uncontrollably down her face. Amaka's voice shook badly as she continued speaking. Sister Mama, thank you for never abandoning me. Thank you for loving me when life became hard. You are my protector, my greatest blessing, and the best woman I know. The entire hall erupted into emotional applause, while Ngozi stood up crying heavily and pulled Amaka into a tight embrace. Both sisters cried in each other's arms for several moments, while guests wiped their eyes emotionally. Even Emeka became deeply touched watching them together. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, Emeka surprised Ngozi and Amaka by taking them to Lagos immediately after the wedding. As they drove through the bright city lights of Lagos, Ngozi stared outside the car window almost speechless from amazement because she had never experienced such comfort before in her life. Eventually, they arrived at Emeka's beautiful mansion in a quiet, rich neighborhood. The large compound, expensive furniture, shining floors, and luxurious decorations overwhelmed Ngozi completely. She stood silently inside the sitting room while tears gathered in her eyes again. Is all this truly real? She whispered softly. Emeka smiled warmly and held her hand. This is your home now, he replied gently. Amaka also became excited immediately. She rushed through the rooms, admiring everything happily like someone living inside a dream. For the first time in decades, Ngozi finally experienced peace. She no longer woke up before sunrise to struggle endlessly at the market. She no longer feared landlords, debts, or hunger. Sometimes she sat quietly in the mansion, simply enjoying the strange feeling of safety she had never known before. Emeka treated her with patience, affection, and respect every single day. But slowly, tiny changes quietly began appearing beneath the happiness, without anybody noticing immediately. The more time Amaka spent around Emeka, the more she noticed things she had never truly paid attention to before. His maturity, his confidence, his calm voice, his generosity, his expensive lifestyle. Most importantly, she noticed how deeply he loved Ngozi. Whenever Emeka looked at her sister with admiration and affection, something uncomfortable slowly twisted inside Amaka's heart. At family gatherings and church events, people constantly praised Ngozi publicly for her sacrifices. You are a rare woman, people often told her. God will continue blessing you for everything you did for Amaka. Each time those praises came, Amaka smiled outwardly, but somewhere deep inside, she quietly began feeling strangely uncomfortable hearing her sister constantly admired like a hero. One evening, while Ngozi and Emeka attended a dinner outside, Amaka entered Ngozi's luxurious bedroom alone. Slowly, she opened the wardrobe and touched the expensive dresses hanging neatly. After staring silently for a long moment, she carefully removed one beautiful designer gown and wore it secretly. Standing alone in front of the large mirror, Amaka stared at her reflection quietly. The expensive dress fit her perfectly. She touched the soft fabric gently while studying herself with strange thoughts moving silently through her mind. Life inside Emeka Daniel's beautiful mansion in Lagos slowly settled into a peaceful routine after the wedding. And for the first time in her life, Ngozi finally experienced comfort without fear. Every morning, she woke up inside a soft bed instead of a leaking room. She no longer carried heavy loads in crowded markets or worried constantly about unpaid bills. Sometimes, she still became emotional over small things like opening a full refrigerator or sitting quietly in an air-conditioned living room because suffering has shaped her life for too many years. Emeka noticed this often and treated her with even more care and patience. You don't have to struggle anymore, he would remind her gently whenever she tried overworking herself around the house. Ngozi usually smiled shyly after hearing those words because part of her still found it difficult believing this new life truly belonged to her. Amaka also adjusted quickly to the luxury around her. She enjoyed the mansion, the expensive lifestyle, and the respect people suddenly showed them because of Emeka's status. At first, everything still felt normal between all of them. Emeka treated Amaka kindly like a younger sister, always asking about her studies and future plans. He bought her gifts occasionally and encouraged her to focus seriously on her education. One afternoon during lunch, he smiled proudly after hearing about her excellent school results. "You are making your sister proud," he said warmly. Amaka smiled happily. "Everything I am today is because of Sister Mama," she replied automatically, though something inside her no longer felt as simple as before. Slowly, without fully realizing it, Amaka began enjoying Emeka's attention too much. She noticed how calm and mature he was compared to the careless young boys at university. He listened when she spoke. He respected women. He carried himself with confidence and stability. Most importantly, he genuinely valued Ngozi deeply, and that strange combination slowly pulled Amaka emotionally closer to him in ways she did not fully understand at first. Little changes quietly began appearing in her behavior. She started dressing differently around him whenever he returned from work. Instead of casual home clothes, she now wore tighter outfits and expensive perfumes more often. And she also looked constantly for excuses to spend time around him. Sometimes she entered his office pretending to ask random questions she could easily solve herself. Other times, she waited in the sitting room late at night just to continue conversations after Ngozi had gone upstairs. Meanwhile, Ngozi remained completely innocent and trusting because the idea of betrayal from either of them never entered her mind. One evening, while preparing dinner in the kitchen, Ngozi smiled happily after noticing Amaka laughing loudly with Emeka in the living room. "I am happy both of you get along well," she said warmly later that night. "Family peace is very important." Amaka forced a smile immediately, while guilt touched her heart briefly. "Of course," she replied softly. "Emeka is a good man." But despite her outward calmness, something darker slowly continued growing quietly inside her. The more she watched Emeka love Ngozi openly, the more uncomfortable she became. Whenever he hugged Ngozi lovingly or complimented her beauty during dinner, Amaka suddenly felt irritated without understanding why. One Saturday evening, Emeka organized a small family dinner at the mansion and invited Ngozi's close friend, Kelechi, along with a few business associates. The atmosphere remained warm and joyful as everyone ate, laughed, and shared stories together. Ngozi sat beside Emeka, glowing with happiness, while he occasionally touched her hand affectionately during conversations. But across the table, Amaka became strangely quiet watching them. At one point, Emeka gently wiped small soup stains from Ngozi's hand playfully, while everyone laughed. Though the moment looked harmless, Amaka suddenly looked away with visible discomfort on her face. Kelechi noticed immediately. Later, during dessert, she also noticed something else strange. Each time Emeka spoke to Amaka directly, the atmosphere between them carried slight tension that did not feel completely innocent anymore. The eye contact lasted too long sometimes. The silence between certain conversations felt awkward. Kelechi became uncomfortable quietly, but said nothing openly because she could not fully explain exactly what bothered her. After dinner, while helping Ngozi clear plates in the kitchen, Kelechi looked thoughtful for a moment before speaking carefully. "Amaka has changed a little," she said slowly. Ngozi laughed lightly, without concern. "University girls change fast these days," she replied jokingly. But Kelechi remained thoughtful. "Just be careful everybody continues respecting boundaries in this house," she added quietly. Ngozi immediately frowned slightly. "Kelechi, what kind of statement is that?" she asked defensively. "Amaka is my sister." Kelechi quickly smiled to avoid further discussion. "Forget it, maybe I'm overthinking." But after leaving the kitchen, her uneasiness remained. As days passed, Amaka's jealousy slowly deepened silently. Sometimes she watched Ngozi carefully while wondering how life would have been if she were the one Emeka married instead. She hated herself each time such thoughts entered her mind, but they kept returning more strongly. Meanwhile, Emeka also began noticing Amaka's beauty more often than he should. At first, he dismissed the thoughts immediately whenever they came, but slowly he became more aware of her perfume, her laughter, and the way she looked at him sometimes. One evening, after returning from work, he found Amaka alone in the sitting room wearing one of Ngozi's elegant gowns while watching television quietly. For a brief second, he stared too long before quickly looking away. "You look different," he said awkwardly. Amaka smiled slightly. "Is that bad?" she asked softly. Emeka immediately cleared his throat uncomfortably. "No, I mean, it suits you." After walking upstairs that night, guilt troubled him deeply, because he knew his thoughts were beginning to cross dangerous lines. He loved Ngozi genuinely, yet something unhealthy was quietly developing inside the house. Then came the night when everything almost changed completely. Heavy rain fell violently across Lagos as strong winds shook the windows of the mansion. Earlier that afternoon, Ngozi had traveled to Abuja for a church women's conference that would last 2 days. Before leaving, she hugged both Emeka and Amaka warmly. "Please take care of yourselves until I return," she said happily. After she left, silence slowly filled the mansion, while rain continued pouring heavily outside. That evening, electricity went off briefly because of the storm, leaving only soft generator lights glowing around the sitting room. Emeka sat alone, drinking wine quietly, listening to the sound of rain hitting the windows. A few minutes later, Amaka entered the room wearing a simple silk nightwear and sat nearby. "You are still awake?" Emeka asked casually. Amaka nodded softly. "I could not sleep because of the storm." He poured wine into another glass silently and handed it to her. At first, their conversation remained normal. They spoke about school, business, life, and loneliness. But slowly, the emotional atmosphere between them began changing. The rain outside, the dim lights, and the quietness of the mansion created dangerous intimacy neither of them fully resisted. At one point, Amaka stared at him silently before speaking softly. "You really love my sister, don't you?" Emeka looked surprised by the question. "Of course I do," he answered honestly. Amaka lowered her eyes slightly. "She deserves happiness after everything she suffered." Emeka nodded slowly. "Your sister is one of the strongest women I have ever met." Silence followed briefly. Then Amaka looked at him again with emotional vulnerability in her eyes. "Sometimes I wish somebody could look at me the way you look at her." Emeka froze immediately after hearing those words. The atmosphere suddenly became dangerously heavy. Neither of them spoke for several seconds while the rain continued crashing outside. Slowly, almost unconsciously, they moved slightly closer towards each other on the couch. Their breathing became tense, their eyes locked silently. Then, just as their faces nearly touched in a dangerous almost kiss, both froze completely in shocked silence as the storm thundered loudly outside. After the uncomfortable moment during the stormy night in the mansion in Lagos, both Emeka and Amaka became deeply disturbed by what almost happened between them. The near kiss remained trapped inside their minds like a dangerous secret neither of them knew how to escape from. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the house felt strangely tense and awkward. Amaka avoided looking directly into Emeka's eyes during breakfast, while Emeka buried himself inside newspapers and phone calls just to avoid conversation. Meanwhile, Ngozi returned happily from her church conference, completely unaware of the emotional chaos waiting quietly inside her own home. The moment she entered the mansion, smiling with gifts in her hands, both Emeka and Amaka immediately felt sharp guilt stabbing through their hearts. Ngozi hugged Amaka warmly first. "I missed both of you so much," she said happily. Then she kissed Emeka gently without noticing how nervous he suddenly became. "How was the conference?" Emeka asked quickly while forcing calmness into his voice. Ngozi smiled brightly. "Wonderful. I prayed specially for our family." Those innocent words made both Emeka and Amaka feel even worse. For the next few days, they both tried creating distance between themselves. Amaka spent more time inside her room or outside with friends, while Emeka stayed longer at work to avoid being alone with her. Each time they accidentally crossed paths inside the mansion, silence immediately filled the air between them. But the more they tried avoiding each other, the stronger the forbidden tension quietly grew. Sometimes Emeka caught himself thinking about her unexpectedly during meetings or while driving home. He hated himself each time it happened because he genuinely loved Ngozi and respected everything she had suffered through in life. Meanwhile, Amaka also battled confusing emotions alone. At first, she blamed herself completely and promised herself never to cross such dangerous boundaries again. But slowly, her feelings became more complicated. She began comparing the careless young men at university to Emeka's maturity, kindness, and stability. She also noticed how deeply he valued Ngozi, and instead of killing her attraction, it somehow made it stronger. One evening, while dressing for a school event, Amaka stood in front of her mirror staring at herself silently. Then she suddenly whispered softly, "Why do I keep thinking about him?" Her own reflection seemed to shame her immediately afterward. Meanwhile, Ngozi remained innocent through everything. She trusted both of them completely and continued treating them with open love and warmth every single day. Sometimes she even laughed happily while saying things like, "I am lucky the two people I love most get along so well." Each time she said such things, Emeka and Amata exchanged guilty looks silently. The contrast between Ngozi's pure trust and the dangerous emotions growing secretly inside the mansion became more painful with each passing day. One afternoon, Ngozi invited Kelechi over again for lunch. During the meal, Kelechi quietly observed the atmosphere carefully and noticed the tension had only worsened. Whenever Amaka and Emeka accidentally touched hands while passing plates or glasses, both immediately pulled away awkwardly. At one point, Kelechi caught Amaka staring at Emeka for several silent seconds before quickly looking away once she realized she was being watched. Kelechi became deeply uncomfortable. Later, while helping Ngozi clean the kitchen, she spoke carefully again. "Ngozi," she said quietly, "are you sure everything is all right in this house?" Ngozi laughed softly. "Kelechi, why do you keep asking strange questions?" Kelechi hesitated briefly. "I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking." Ngozi smiled confidently. "Emeka respects me too much to hurt me, and Amaka would never betray me. Those two are the closest people in my life." Hearing those words filled Kelechi with uneasiness she could not explain properly. Days later, another heavy storm arrived across Lagos. Rain poured violently outside while thunder shook the windows of the mansion again. Ngozi traveled unexpectedly to spend the night with an elderly church member who had fallen seriously sick, leaving only Emeka and Amaka inside the house once more. Both tried staying separate that evening. Emeka remained inside his office working late, while Amaka stayed upstairs pretending to study. But the emotional tension between them had already become dangerously difficult to control. Around midnight, the electricity suddenly went off briefly because of the storm. Amaka slowly walked downstairs carrying candles nervously and found Emeka sitting alone in the dim sitting room looking troubled. "The rain is really bad tonight," she said softly while placing candles on the table. Emeka nodded without looking directly at her. "Yes." Silence followed awkwardly. Then Amaka sat down slowly across from him. "Are we going to keep pretending nothing happened that night?" she asked quietly. Emeka immediately sighed deeply. "Amaka, please, don't start this." But she continued softly, "I have been trying to forget it too." Emeka stood up frustrated and walked towards the window while rain crashed heavily outside. "Your sister trusts both of us," he said painfully. "Ngozi does not deserve this." Amaka lowered her eyes silently. "I know." Another long silence followed before Emeka finally sat down heavily. Slowly, their emotional conversation became more personal and vulnerable. They spoke about loneliness, pressure, regrets, and hidden feelings they were both struggling to bury. The storm outside somehow made everything feel even more dangerous and emotional. At one point, Amaka's eyes filled with tears unexpectedly. "Sometimes I feel invisible," she admitted softly. "People only see Ngozi's sacrifices and goodness. Nobody really sees me." Emeka looked at her carefully. "That is not true." Amaka laughed bitterly. "It is. Everywhere we go, people praise her and pity me. Sometimes I feel like I'm only existing inside her shadow." Emeka moved closer gently, trying to comfort her emotionally. "Ngozi loves you deeply," he said softly. But Amaka looked directly into his eyes this time. "What about you?" The question hung heavily between them, while thunder echoed loudly outside. Emeka should have stood up immediately. He should have walked away. But instead, emotional weakness slowly overcame both of them. Their pain, attraction, loneliness, and forbidden tension finally collapsed together dangerously in that quiet, stormy night. What began as emotional comfort crossed into betrayal. Later afterward, reality crashed down on them painfully. Silence filled the room while rain still fell outside. Amaka sat trembling with tears rolling uncontrollably down her cheeks, while Emeka buried his face inside his hands, completely horrified by what they had done. God, he whispered painfully, what have we done? Amaka began crying harder immediately. This was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Emeka stood up restlessly like a man losing his mind. Ngozi trusted both of us, he said brokenly. Ngozi trusted both of us. Shame and guilt consumed them completely that night. They promised each other repeatedly that it would never happen again. We will forget this ever happened, Emeka insisted desperately. This can never happen again. Amaka nodded tearfully, even though part of her already knew things had changed permanently between them. But despite all the guilt and promises, the secret betrayal quietly continued afterward. One mistake slowly became another. Emotional conversations became hidden meetings. Long eye contact became dangerous attachment. Meanwhile, Ngozi remained completely unaware, loving both of them wholeheartedly with innocent trust. She still cooked meals for them happily, prayed for them, and smiled proudly whenever she saw them laughing normally. The painful contrast between her pure love and the hidden betrayal inside the mansion became more heartbreaking every single day. Slowly, Amaka became emotionally attached to Emeka in ways she could no longer control, while Emeka himself became trapped between deep guilt and dangerous desire. One evening, Ngozi sat excitedly in the dining room writing plans for a surprise anniversary celebration she wanted to organize secretly for Emeka. She smiled happily while discussing cake designs and decorations with a party planner over the phone. "I want it to be special," she said joyfully. "That man brought peace into my life." Across the room, Amaka watched them quietly as Emeka walked over to hug Ngozi lovingly from behind while she laughed happily in his arms. Outwardly, Amaka smiled softly at the beautiful scene before her, but inside her chest, jealousy burned silently and dangerously like hidden fire. Life inside the beautiful mansion in Lagos slowly became heavier with secrets and hidden tension as the forbidden relationship between Emeka and Amaka continued growing deeper every day. What started as one terrible mistake during a stormy night had now become a dangerous emotional affair neither of them truly controlled anymore. At first, Emeka tried convincing himself that everything would stop naturally if he focused more on his marriage and created distance between himself and Amaka. But the more he tried pulling away, the more emotionally attached Amaka became. She no longer looked at him like her sister's husband alone. She now looked at him with desire, emotional dependence, and silent possessiveness that frightened even herself. Whenever Ngozi traveled briefly or spent time outside the house, Amaka immediately found excuses to be around Emeka. Late at night, she entered his office pretending to ask questions about school or business matters. Sometimes she sat quietly near him while he worked, staring at him longer than she should. One evening, Emeka finally became frustrated and looked at her seriously. "Amaka, this cannot continue," he said firmly. "We already crossed boundaries we should never have crossed." Amaka looked at him quietly before speaking softly. "So, it is easy for you to forget me?" Emeka sighed tiredly and rubbed his face with stress. "It is not about forgetting you. It is about doing what is right." But Amaka's eyes suddenly filled with emotion. "You think this is easy for me too?" she whispered painfully. "You think I planned any of this?" Those emotional confrontations only made things more complicated instead of ending them. Amaka also began sending emotional messages to Emeka whenever Ngozi was absent or asleep. Sometimes the messages were simple. "Are you awake?" Other times they became more personal and manipulative. "I hate pretending around everybody. You only avoid me because you are scared. Sometimes I wish I met you before Ngozi did." Each message pulled Emeka deeper into guilt and emotional confusion. Though he knew the relationship was destroying his peace, he kept failing to end it completely. Meanwhile, Ngozi remained painfully unaware of the true darkness growing inside her own home. She still loved both Emeka and Amaka wholeheartedly and trusted them with complete innocence. However, small strange moments slowly began making her uncomfortable, even though she refused to suspect betrayal. Sometimes conversations stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. Other times she noticed unusual silence between Emeka and Amaka during dinner. Once, Emeka entered his office unexpectedly and found Amaka sitting too close beside him while discussing something quietly. Both immediately became nervous after seeing her. Ngozi frowned slightly for a second before forcing herself to ignore the strange feeling inside her chest. "Am I disturbing you people?" she asked jokingly. Amaka laughed too quickly. "No now, Sister Mama. We were only talking about school." Ngozi smiled and nodded, refusing to overthink the moment because trust blinded her completely. But outside the family, other people slowly began noticing uncomfortable signs too. One afternoon, Kelechi visited the mansion again and immediately sensed the emotional tension in the atmosphere. During lunch, she carefully watched how Amaka looked at Emeka whenever Ngozi was distracted. She also noticed how Emeka avoided eye contact with Amaka sometimes, as if hiding something. After the meal, Kelechi pulled Ngozi aside privately into the kitchen. "Ngozi," she said carefully, "please don't be angry with me for what I am about to say." Ngozi looked confused immediately. "What is it?" Kelechi hesitated briefly before speaking softly. "Something about this house does not feel right anymore." Ngozi frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Kelechi lowered her voice further. "I don't know exactly, but the closeness between Amaka and Emeka is beginning to make me uncomfortable." The moment those words left her mouth, Ngozi's expression changed immediately. "Kelechi," she said sharply in disbelief, "how can you even think such a thing?" Kelechi sighed softly. "I am only telling you what I feel as your friend." But Ngozi became offended instantly. "Amaka is my sister," she replied firmly. "That girl suffered with me for years. She would never betray me." Kelechi tried speaking again carefully. "And Emeka?" Ngozi shook her head strongly. "Emeka respects me too much. Please don't ever say this kind of thing again." Seeing Ngozi's defensive reaction, Kelechi remained silent afterward, even though her uneasiness only grew stronger. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, the hidden affair became more reckless emotionally. Amaka no longer feared setting boundaries the way she once did. Sometimes she intentionally interrupted romantic moments between Ngozi and Emeka because jealousy now burned constantly inside her chest. One evening, Ngozi happily rested her head on Emeka's shoulder while they watched television together in the sitting room. Suddenly, Amaka walked in wearing a short nightdress and sat directly beside Emeka instead of using another chair. The atmosphere immediately became awkward. Ngozi looked slightly surprised but still smiled innocently. "Amaka, are you not sleeping yet?" she asked warmly. "I was feeling lonely upstairs," Amaka replied while staring quietly at Emeka instead of her sister. Moments like that slowly filled the house with hidden discomfort nobody openly discussed. At the same time, gossip quietly began spreading among some house staff and neighbors. Workers inside the mansion noticed strange behaviors between Amaka and Emeka. One maid once saw Amaka leaving Emeka's office very late at night looking nervous. Another staff member noticed how tense both became whenever Ngozi entered unexpectedly. Though nobody had proof of anything, whispers quietly started moving around behind closed doors. One afternoon, Ngozi attended a women's church gathering nearby, where some women began praising Ngozi openly. "Ngozi, God will bless you forever for what you did for your sister," one woman said emotionally. Another added, "Not many women can sacrifice their whole lives the way you did for Amaka." Ngozi smiled softly and lowered her eyes shyly while thanking them politely. Nearby, Amaka listened silently while forcing herself to smile too. But deep inside, those praises now irritated her badly instead of making her proud. She hated constantly being seen only as the lucky younger sister rescued by Ngozi. As the women continued praising Ngozi's goodness, Amaka suddenly felt trapped inside a life where her sister always appeared perfect while she remained invisible in comparison. That evening, after returning home, Amaka locked herself inside her bathroom, feeling emotionally overwhelmed. For several days already, she had been feeling weak, restless, and strangely emotional. At first, she blamed stress and anxiety, but now fear slowly entered her heart. Her hands trembled badly as she stared at a small pregnancy test box she had secretly bought earlier that day. After several long, nervous minutes, she finally forced herself to take the test. Then she waited silently, while her heartbeat pounded loudly inside her chest. Slowly, the result appeared clearly before her eyes. The moment she understood what she was seeing, her entire body went cold with fear. Amaka staggered backwards slightly while staring at the positive result in complete shock. Her fingers trembled violently as tears slowly filled her eyes. Alone inside the bathroom, she whispered weakly, "Oh God," while fear, panic, confusion, and dangerous possibilities crashed violently through her mind all at once. The positive pregnancy test hidden inside Amaka's trembling hands changed everything inside the mansion in Lagos from that moment forward. For several long minutes after seeing the result, she remained frozen inside the bathroom staring at the small device like somebody trapped inside a nightmare. Her heartbeat pounded violently while different emotions crashed through her mind all at once. Fear, confusion, shock. But slowly, another feeling quietly entered her heart too. Dangerous hope. She sat down slowly on the bathroom floor while tears rolled down her cheeks. "What have I done?" she whispered weakly. Yet even as fear consumed her, part of her already knew this pregnancy could change everything permanently between her, Ngozi, and Emeka. That same night, Amaka could barely sleep. She kept touching her stomach nervously while staring into darkness. Meanwhile, downstairs, Ngozi remained happily busy planning her wedding anniversary surprise for Emeka, completely unaware of the storm silently growing inside her own house. The next morning, Amaka waited anxiously until Ngozi left for church activities before finally gathering courage to tell Emeka the truth. Her hands shook badly as she entered his office quietly while he worked on his laptop. Emeka looked up immediately after noticing her expression. "Amaka, what happened?" he asked with concern. Without speaking immediately, Amaka slowly placed the pregnancy test on his table. The moment Emeka understood what he was seeing, the color disappeared from his face instantly. He stood up immediately in complete shock. "No," he whispered weakly. "No, no, no." Amaka's eyes filled with tears. "I checked twice," she said softly. "It is positive." Emeka staggered backward slightly and held his head with both hands like a man losing control of his mind. "Jesus Christ," he muttered repeatedly while pacing around the office restlessly. "This cannot be happening." Amaka watched him silently before finally speaking the words both already understood. "The child is yours." Those words hit Emeka even harder. He stopped moving completely and stared at her in disbelief mixed with panic. For several seconds, silence filled the room heavily. Then he rushed toward her anxiously. "Does Ngozi know anything?" he asked quickly. Amaka shook her head immediately. "No." Emeka exhaled shakily with slight relief before grabbing her shoulders desperately. "Listen to me carefully," he said in a trembling voice. "Nobody must hear about this, especially Ngozi. Please, just give me time to think." But while panic consumed Emeka completely, something different slowly started happening inside Amaka's heart. Instead of feeling only fear and guilt, she gradually began seeing the pregnancy as something powerful. For the first time since the affair started, she no longer felt weak or hidden. She now carried something that connected her permanently to Emeka in a way Ngozi never could. Over the following days, her fear slowly transformed into dangerous ambition. She began convincing herself that maybe fate had finally chosen her instead of her sister. The more she thought about it, the more entitled she started feeling towards Emeka's love, wealth, and life. Meanwhile, Emeka became emotionally unstable from pressure and guilt. He barely slept at night anymore and constantly looked distracted during conversations. Sometimes, he snapped angrily at workers for small mistakes. Other times, he sat alone for hours, staring silently into space while fear consumed him. Ngozi noticed the changes immediately and became worried, but because of her innocent trust, she assumed work stress was the problem. One evening while serving him dinner, she touched his arm gently and asked softly, "Emeka, are you all right these days?" Emeka forced a weak smile immediately. "Business pressure," he lied quickly. "Too many problems at work." Ngozi looked at him sympathetically and squeezed his hand lovingly. "You should rest more," she said kindly. "You carry too much stress." Hearing her gentle concern almost destroyed Emeka emotionally because he knew he was betraying the only woman who had ever truly trusted him completely. Unknown to everyone inside the mansion, Ngozi herself had also been carrying a painful secret quietly throughout the marriage. Twice during the past year, she had become pregnant secretly and lost the babies through heartbreaking miscarriages before even telling many people. The losses shattered her emotionally, but she buried the pain silently because she feared becoming a burden to Emeka. Only her doctor and Kelechi knew the full truth. Sometimes, late at night, Ngozi still cried quietly, remembering the babies she never got to hold. Yet, despite the pain, she kept praying faithfully that one day, Ngozi and Emeka would finally become parents together. Ironically, while she silently mourned her miscarriages, Amaka now carried Emeka's child inside the same house. As the weeks passed, Amaka became bolder emotionally. She no longer behaved like someone ashamed of the affair. Instead, she slowly started acting possessive towards Emeka and increasingly resentful towards Ngozi. One afternoon, after Ngozi traveled briefly to attend a women's fellowship meeting, Amaka entered Emeka's office again while he worked restlessly. "We need to talk seriously," she said calmly. Emeka immediately looked tense. "About what?" Amaka folded her arms quietly. "About the future." Emeka sighed heavily. "Amaka, please, not now." But Amaka moved closer instead. "You cannot keep pretending this baby changes nothing." Emeka stood up angrily. "What exactly do you want from me?" Amaka stared directly into his eyes before answering softly but boldly. "I want the life Ngozi has." That statement shocked Emeka completely. "What?" he asked in disbelief. Amaka's voice became emotional immediately. "I sacrificed enough already," she said bitterly. "All my life, people only praised Ngozi while I stood behind her shadow. She got the love, she got the respect, she got the beautiful marriage. And now, maybe life is finally choosing me too." Emeka looked horrified by her words. "Ngozi is your sister," he said painfully. But Amaka shook her head slowly. "She's also getting older," she whispered dangerously. "And after all the miscarriages, what if she never gives you children?" The moment those words left her mouth, Emeka stared at her like he no longer recognized her completely. "Don't ever say that again," he warned sharply. But Amaka remained calm. "It is the truth." The conversation left Emeka deeply shaken afterwards. For the first time, he fully realized how dangerous the situation had become. This was no longer just a hidden affair fueled by weakness and guilt. The pregnancy had changed the emotional balance completely, and Amaka now wanted far more than secrecy. Meanwhile, Ngozi continued loving both of them innocently, without suspecting the destruction silently growing around her. One bright afternoon, she spent hours shopping happily for Emeka's anniversary surprise. She carefully bought an expensive wristwatch, decorations, and a special cake, while smiling excitedly the entire time. Even the salesgirl at the shop laughed warmly after seeing her happiness. "Your husband must really be special," the young woman said playfully. Ngozi smiled proudly immediately. "He changed my life," she replied softly. Carrying the carefully wrapped gift bags against her chest, Ngozi returned home earlier than expected that same afternoon, completely unaware that her entire world was only moments away from collapsing forever. The bright afternoon sun shone beautifully across the streets of Lagos as Ngozi Daniels returned home happily with several gift bags held tightly in her hands. Her heart felt unusually light that day because she had spent hours preparing a special surprise anniversary celebration for Emeka. Inside the bags were expensive gifts, decorations, and the wristwatch she carefully chose after saving her own personal money secretly for weeks. As she sat inside the taxi heading home, she kept smiling to herself while imagining Emeka's reaction later that evening. Even after everything life had done to her, Ngozi still felt grateful every single day for the peace and love she believed she had finally found. She also planned to thank Amaka properly for helping organize some of the anniversary preparations recently. "God has truly blessed this family," she whispered softly to herself while touching the small gold necklace around her neck emotionally. When the taxi finally stopped in front of the mansion, Ngozi stepped out happily and entered the compound quietly because she wanted to surprise Emeka properly. The house looked unusually silent that afternoon, but she assumed both Emeka and Amaka were upstairs resting. Smiling to herself, she carried the gift bags carefully while walking through the sitting room quietly. Then suddenly, soft, strange sounds from upstairs stopped her movement completely. At first, she frowned slightly in confusion. The sounds were low and unclear, almost like whispered voices mixed with movement. Maybe they are watching television, she thought innocently at first. But as she slowly climbed the staircase, the strange sounds became clearer. Ngozi's smile slowly faded. Confusion entered her face immediately. Her heartbeat suddenly became uneasy without explanation. Slowly, she walked toward her bedroom door while holding the gifts tightly against her chest. Then she noticed something that made her stomach tighten painfully. The bedroom door was not fully closed. It remained slightly open. Silence suddenly filled Ngozi's ears loudly as fear she could not explain entered her chest. With trembling fingers, she slowly pushed the door wider open. Then her entire world shattered instantly. There, on the bed, inside her own bedroom, were Emeka and Amaka, together, half-dressed, frozen, guilty. Time itself seemed to stop completely inside that room. The gift bag slipped slowly from Ngozi's trembling hands onto the floor as the expensive wristwatch box burst open beside her feet. Nobody moved immediately. Nobody even breathed properly. Amaka's eyes widened in complete horror, while Emeka jumped backward from the bed like a man struck by lightning. Ngozi simply stood there, staring at them in silence, unable to understand what her own eyes were seeing. Her lips trembled violently while tears slowly gathered in her eyes. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot, too unreal. Emeka tried speaking first, his voice shaking badly. "Ngozi," but the words died immediately inside his throat. Amaka quickly grabbed the bedsheet against her body while tears filled her eyes instantly. Yet, Ngozi still remained silent. Her body shook so badly she almost lost balance. She stared at Emeka briefly before finally turning slowly toward Amaka. The pain inside her eyes was deeper than anger. It was disbelief, betrayal, complete destruction. Then, in a weak, broken voice that sounded almost like a child crying, she whispered softly, "Amaka, you too?" Those three words destroyed the room emotionally. Amaka immediately burst into uncontrollable tears. "Sister Mama," she cried painfully, but Ngozi staggered backward like someone physically wounded. "No," she whispered repeatedly while shaking her head slowly. "No, no." Emeka rushed toward her desperately. "Ngozi, please listen to me." But Ngozi suddenly screamed loudly for the first time. "Don't touch me!" Her voice echoed painfully through the mansion. Emeka froze immediately while Amaka continued crying helplessly on the bed. Ngozi's entire body trembled violently as years of memories crashed through her mind all at once. She remembered carrying Amaka through rain as a child. She remembered starving to feed her. She remembered dropping out of school for her. She remembered standing beside their parents' graves, promising never to abandon her little sister. Now, the same child she raised like a daughter sat in bed with her husband. Ngozi covered her mouth painfully as loud sobs escaped her chest. "Why?" she cried brokenly while staring at Amaka. "Why would you do this to me?" Amaka could barely speak through her tears. "I am sorry," she whispered weakly. But Ngozi laughed bitterly through her pain. "Sorry? You slept with my husband and all you can say is sorry?" Amaka stepped forward again desperately. "Ngozi, please, this is my fault too." Ngozi turned sharply toward him with heartbreak burning inside her eyes. "You," she whispered painfully, "after everything I told you about my life, after all the trust I gave you." Her voice completely broke apart. Emeka lowered his head in shame because there were no words left to defend himself anymore. Ngozi suddenly began crying uncontrollably. The sound of her crying filled the entire mansion painfully, while both Emeka and Amaka stood frozen in guilt and horror. She stumbled backward slowly before running out of the room like somebody escaping death itself. Downstairs, she collapsed onto the sitting room floor, sobbing heavily, while memories kept replaying inside her mind like torture. Upstairs, Amaka remained on the bed, crying uncontrollably too, while Emeka stood near the wall, feeling completely destroyed by guilt. Within hours, the scandal began spreading quietly beyond the mansion. One maid overheard Ngozi screaming earlier and secretly told another worker what happened. By evening, whispers had already started moving through neighbors and church members. People spoke in shock and disbelief. Amaka slept with her own sister's husband? After everything Ngozi sacrificed for her? Even family members who heard the news became horrified. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, silence and pain swallowed everything. Ngozi refused speaking to either Emeka or Amaka. She locked herself inside another room while both remained downstairs trapped in shame and fear. At one point, Amaka stood outside Ngozi's door crying heavily. "Sister Mama, please," she begged weakly. "Please open the door." But Ngozi remained silent inside while tears rolled endlessly down her face. Night eventually fell over Lagos, but the darkness inside the mansion felt heavier than anything outside. Alone inside the bathroom later that night, Ngozi finally collapsed completely onto the cold floor. She cried so hard her body shook violently and painful memories flooded her mind one after another. She remembered frying akara before sunrise. She remembered going hungry so Amaka could eat. She remembered washing school uniforms late at night under lantern light. She remembered praying desperately beside their parents' graves never to abandon her little sister. Now, everything felt meaningless. Through loud, uncontrollable sobs, Ngozi pressed both hands against her chest like somebody dying slowly from heartbreak. "Why would you do this to me?" she cried repeatedly through tears, while the sound of her broken voice echoed painfully inside the empty bathroom. After the terrible scandal exploded inside the mansion in Lagos, nothing in the family remained the same again. The once peaceful home became filled with silence, shame, bitterness, and emotional destruction. Ngozi moved around the house like a broken shadow, barely speaking to anyone. Her eyes remained swollen constantly from crying, and she stopped caring about food, sleep, or even her appearance. Sometimes she sat alone for hours, staring blankly at walls, while painful memories replayed endlessly inside her mind. Everywhere she looked inside the mansion reminded her of betrayal. The dining room where they once laughed together, the staircase she climbed happily carrying anniversary gifts, the bedroom where she watched her entire life collapse before her eyes. Meanwhile, Emeka also looked emotionally destroyed. He barely slept and constantly avoided looking directly at Ngozi because guilt consumed him completely. Several times he tried apologizing desperately, but each attempt only reopened Ngozi's wounds deeper. One morning, he stood outside her room quietly and knocked softly. "Ngozi, please let us talk," he begged weakly. But from inside the room, Ngozi's cold voice answered immediately. "The day I buried my parents, I thought pain could never become worse than that. I was wrong." Those words silenced Emeka completely. But while Emeka remained trapped in guilt, Amaka slowly became more determined instead of ashamed. The pregnancy had changed her emotionally in dangerous ways. Deep inside her mind, she had already convinced herself that Ngozi's marriage was over permanently and that fate had finally given her the life she deserved. Though she still cried sometimes from guilt, ambition and emotional obsession now controlled her more strongly than conscience. Days after the scandal, tension inside the mansion became unbearable. Ngozi refused eating at the same table with either of them. She avoided Amaka completely and spoke to Emeka only when absolutely necessary. One evening, after another painful argument, Amaka finally confronted Emeka privately. "This situation cannot continue like this," she said firmly. Emeka rubbed his forehead tiredly. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Amaka looked directly into his eyes. "Your wife already hates both of us. Everybody already knows the truth, and I am carrying your child." Emeka looked uncomfortable immediately. "Amaka," but she interrupted him sharply. "You cannot keep treating me like a mistake anymore." Over the following days, Amaka emotionally pressured him constantly using the pregnancy. She cried. She accused him of abandoning her. She reminded him repeatedly that Ngozi might never forgive either of them anyway. Eventually, under pressure, confusion, and guilt, Emeka made the terrible decision that completely shattered Ngozi finally. One quiet morning, Emeka packed her belongings openly and moved into another apartment with Emeka. The moment Ngozi saw the suitcases being carried downstairs, she understood immediately what was happening. She stood silently near the staircase while tears gathered slowly in her eyes again. "So this is how it ends?" she whispered weakly. Emeka looked ashamed while avoiding her eyes completely, but Amaka stood beside him protectively, almost like a wife already defending her territory. Ngozi stared at her painfully. "After everything I did for you, you are still living with him openly?" Amaka's face showed guilt briefly before hardening again. "I did not plan for things to happen this way," she replied quietly. Ngozi laughed bitterly through tears. "No, you planned worse." When Emeka and Amaka finally left the mansion together that day, Ngozi felt like she had lost not only her marriage, but her entire family at once. Outside the house, gossip spread across church members, neighbors, relatives, and even market women like wildfire. Everybody discussed the scandal endlessly. Some people sympathized deeply with Ngozi, while others cruelly blamed her instead. At church, women whispered behind her back during services. "Maybe she focused too much on her sister and forgot her husband," one woman murmured carelessly. Another sighed dramatically. "Men do not cheat unless something is missing at home." Those cruel words destroyed Ngozi emotionally because she had already sacrificed everything for love and family. Even some distant relatives quietly mocked her situation. "See how the child she trained paid her back," people whispered. The humiliation became unbearable. Eventually, Ngozi stopped attending church and avoided most people completely. She remained isolated inside the mansion alone for days, barely eating or speaking. Sometimes, Mama Oduak visited and found her sitting in darkness silently. One afternoon, the elderly woman held Ngozi's hand sadly and whispered, "My daughter, please don't allow this pain to destroy your life." But Ngozi simply stared blankly ahead and replied softly, "Everything I lived for is gone." Meanwhile, life between Emeka and Amaka quickly became more tense than either of them expected. Though Amaka initially felt victorious after moving in openly with him, reality soon became different from fantasy. Emeka no longer behaved like the calm, loving man she imagined. Guilt constantly followed him everywhere. He drank more often, became emotionally distant, and sometimes stared into space for long periods, thinking about Ngozi. This deeply irritated Amaka. She wanted his complete attention and emotional loyalty now that she had risked everything for him. Gradually, her behavior became controlling and emotionally unstable. She constantly questioned him about phone calls, work meetings, and even small conversations with other women. One evening, Emeka returned home earlier than expected after work. As he approached the sitting room quietly, he overheard Amaka speaking nervously on the phone near the balcony. "I already told you to stop saying that," she whispered angrily. Then, after a brief pause, her next words made Emeka freeze completely where he stood. Silence swallowed the room instantly as shock crashed through his entire body. Standing silently behind the wall, he stared ahead in complete disbelief while Amaka continued speaking unknowingly on the phone, completely unaware that the man she betrayed her sister for had just overheard the words that could destroy everything again. After overhearing the shocking phone conversation inside the apartment in Lagos, Emeka Daniels could barely breathe properly from disbelief and fear. The words kept replaying violently inside his head all night. "I am not even fully sure the baby belongs to him." He sat alone in the sitting room long after Amaka slept upstairs, staring blankly into darkness while guilt, anger, and confusion destroyed his peace completely. For the first time since the affair began, the full weight of what he had done crashed heavily onto him without excuses. He had betrayed a woman who loved him sincerely, destroyed his marriage, humiliated Ngozi publicly, and abandoned his home, all for a relationship now filled with secrets and lies. The next morning, Emeka looked at Amaka differently. Suspicion had entered his eyes permanently. Though he said nothing immediately, his behavior changed noticeably. He became colder, quieter, and emotionally distant. Amaka noticed it almost immediately. During breakfast, she looked at him nervously. "You barely slept," she said carefully. Emeka nodded shortly without meeting his eyes. "Too much on my mind." Amaka studied his face silently, sensing danger already. Unknown to her, Emeka had already begun investigating her past secretly. Over the following days, Emeka contacted one of his trusted business associates in Enugu and asked discreet questions about Amaka's university life. At first, the information sounded harmless: parties, wealthy friends, and campus relationships. But slowly, darker details began surfacing. One evening, Emeka sat silently inside his office while listening to his associate speak over the phone. "There was a married lecturer connected to her back then," the man explained carefully. "People gossiped about them seriously on campus. The lecturer almost lost his marriage because of the scandal." Emeka's chest tightened painfully. "What happened after?" he asked quietly. The man hesitated briefly before answering. "People said she became pregnant at some point. Then, suddenly, everything disappeared quietly." Emeka froze completely. "Pregnant?" The man lowered his voice. "That is what people believed. There were also rumors she had some complications afterwards." After ending the call, Emeka remained seated silently for several minutes while horror slowly consumed him. For the first time, he realized how little he truly knew about the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. Meanwhile, Amaka herself became increasingly paranoid and emotionally unstable as her hidden secrets slowly threatened to surface. She constantly worried about the mysterious caller exposing her past. Sometimes, she woke up sweating heavily from nightmares. Other times, she stared anxiously at her phone for hours expecting another threatening message. The emotional pressure began affecting her badly. One afternoon, while Emeka showered upstairs, another call entered her phone again. The same male voice laughed mockingly. "So the rich man still believes the baby is his?" he asked cruelly. Amaka immediately lowered her voice angrily. "Please, stop this." But the man continued coldly. "You used people before, Amaka. Now life is paying you back." After ending the call, Amaka broke down crying alone in the kitchen because fear was slowly swallowing her peace completely. Meanwhile, across Lagos, Ngozi slowly began rebuilding herself emotionally from the ashes of betrayal. Though the pain still haunted her daily, Kelechi and elderly Mama Uduak refused allowing her remain completely destroyed forever. They visited often, encouraged her gently, and slowly pushed her back to life again. At first, Ngozi barely responded to anyone. She remained emotionally withdrawn and deeply wounded. But one afternoon, Mama Uduak took her to visit a shelter housing abandoned women and orphan girls. Seeing children who had suffered neglect and pain touched something deep inside Ngozi's broken heart. One small orphan girl hugged her tightly and whispered softly, "Auntie, please don't go." That moment changed something quietly inside Ngozi. Slowly, instead of drowning completely in revenge and bitterness, Ngozi began spending more time helping vulnerable women and children in the community. She donated food, helped pay school fees quietly, and spent hours comforting abandoned girls who reminded her painfully of Amaka as a child. One evening, Kelechi watched Ngozi helping serve food to struggling widows and shook her head emotionally. "After everything Amaka did to you, your heart is still this soft," she said quietly. Ngozi smiled weakly through sadness. "Pain taught me how important kindness is," she replied softly. "I cannot become bitter completely." Meanwhile, Emeka's investigation into Amaka's past continued troubling him deeply. Eventually, he secretly arranged to meet Dr. Ibrahim, a private doctor connected to Amaka's former university scandal. At first, the doctor refused speaking openly because of patient confidentiality. But after Emeka explained the seriousness of the situation, the older man finally sighed heavily. "I should not discuss details," Dr. Ibrahim said carefully, "but since your lives are already connected, you deserve to understand certain risks." Emeka listened silently while fear built inside him. Dr. Ibrahim removed his glasses slowly before continuing. "Years ago, Amaka had complications after a dangerous abortion procedure." Emeka closed his eyes briefly in shock. The doctor continued sadly. The procedure damaged her internally more than she admitted publicly. Since then, carrying pregnancy safely may become difficult for her. The room suddenly felt heavy and suffocating around him. "Are you saying?" he whispered weakly. Dr. Ibrahim nodded slowly. "Any pregnancy now carries high medical risk." Emeka left the hospital completely shaken. As he sat inside his car afterward, he finally broke down emotionally for the first time since the scandal began. Tears gathered in his eyes while regret crushed him heavily. He remembered Ngozi's goodness, loyalty, sacrifices, and pure love. Then he compared it to the lies, manipulation, and destruction surrounding his relationship with Amaka now. "What have I done?" he whispered painfully while gripping the steering wheel tightly. That evening, when he returned home, the atmosphere between him and Amaka immediately felt tense. Amaka noticed the strange coldness in his face and became nervous instantly. "What is wrong with you these days?" she asked anxiously. Emeka stared at her silently for several seconds before speaking. "How many lies have you told me?" The question froze Amaka immediately. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. Emeka's voice became harder. "The lecturer, the pregnancy before, the abortion." Amaka's face lost color instantly. "Who told you all that?" she whispered fearfully. Emeka laughed bitterly. "So it is true." Panic entered Amaka's eyes immediately. "Emeka, please, let me explain." But Emeka exploded emotionally for the first time. "Explain what exactly? That I destroyed my marriage for someone hiding this many secrets from me?" Amaka began crying immediately. "I was scared," she cried painfully. "I did not want to lose you." Emeka shook his head furiously. "Did you even know if this baby is mine?" The question hit Amaka like a slap. Silence filled the apartment heavily. Tears rolled uncontrollably down her face as guilt and fear overwhelmed her completely. I was confused," she whispered weakly. Emeka stared at her with disgust and heartbreak. "You ruined everything," he said painfully. "You destroyed your sister's life, and now I don't even know what is real." Their argument became louder and more emotionally violent as buried anger, guilt, fear, and regret exploded between them completely. Amaka screamed back through tears, accusing him of emotionally using her and abandoning her now that things became difficult. Emeka shouted angrily about lies and manipulation while pacing around the sitting room in frustration. Suddenly, in the middle of the terrible argument, Amaka grabbed her stomach sharply and gasped painfully. Her entire body bent forward suddenly while fear filled her eyes. "Ah!" she cried out weakly before collapsing heavily onto the floor in pain, while Emeka froze immediately in complete shock. The moment Amaka collapsed screaming in pain inside the apartment in Lagos, fear swallowed the entire room instantly. Emeka rushed toward her in complete panic as blood slowly spread beneath her on the floor. "Amaka!" he shouted loudly while kneeling beside her trembling body. Amaka held her stomach tightly while crying uncontrollably from pain and terror. "The baby," she whispered weakly. "Please, save my baby." Emeka's hand shook badly as he quickly carried her toward the car while rain poured heavily outside the building. Throughout the desperate drive to the hospital, Amaka cried painfully in the backseat while Emeka kept begging her to stay conscious. "Please don't close your eyes," he said fearfully. "We're almost there." The moment they arrived at the emergency unit, doctors and nurses rushed Amaka inside immediately while Emeka followed helplessly behind, covered in sweat and fear. Inside the hospital corridors, everything became confusion, panic, and painful waiting. Nurses moved quickly while doctors shouted instructions urgently. Emeka sat outside the emergency room feeling completely broken as memories of everything that led to this moment crashed violently through his mind. For the first time, he truly saw the full destruction his choices had caused. He had betrayed Ngozi's trust, destroyed his marriage, humiliated the woman who loved him sincerely, and now another life was hanging dangerously between survival and death. Several long hours passed painfully before Dr. Ibrahim finally walked toward him slowly with a serious face. The moment Emeka saw the doctor's expression, his heart immediately sank. "Doctor," he whispered weakly while standing up quickly. Dr. Ibrahim sighed deeply before speaking softly. "We managed to stabilize Amaka for now." Emeka exhaled slightly with relief, but the doctor's face remained heavy. Then, the older man lowered his eyes sadly and added, "But we could not save the pregnancy." The words hit Emeka like a physical blow. He slowly sat back down in complete silence while guilt swallowed him entirely. Dr. Ibrahim continued gently. "The complications were severe because of previous internal damage. Her body is very weak." Emeka covered his face painfully with both hands while tears gathered in his eyes for the first time openly. "Oh God, what have I done?" Later that evening, when Amaka finally regained consciousness weakly inside the hospital room, she immediately touched her stomach anxiously before looking toward the doctor with frightened eyes. "My baby?" she asked softly. Silence filled the room briefly before Dr. Ibrahim answered carefully, "I am very sorry, Amaka." The moment she understood the truth, her entire body shook violently as loud, painful sobs escaped her chest. "No!" she cried uncontrollably. "No, please!" She broke down completely while Emeka stood helplessly near the wall, unable to comfort her properly anymore. Amaka cried for hours afterward, like someone whose soul had shattered completely. But the worst pain came later when Dr. Ibrahim spoke privately to both of them again. Because of the previous abortion complications and the recent miscarriage, he explained carefully, future pregnancies may become very difficult and dangerous. Amaka stared at him in complete horror. "What are you saying?" she whispered weakly. The doctor sighed sadly. "Your chances of carrying another pregnancy safely are now very low." Those words destroyed her emotionally. After the doctor left, Amaka curled herself tightly on the hospital bed while crying silently into her pillow. For the first time since the betrayal began, all the confidence, pride, and ambition she carried disappeared completely. She no longer looked like the glamorous woman who stole her sister's husband. She looked lost, broken, and deeply ashamed. Meanwhile, Emeka remained trapped inside unbearable regret and guilt. Every time he looked at Amaka now, he no longer saw excitement or forbidden attraction. Instead, he saw pain, lies, destruction, and the ruins of the peaceful life he once had with Ngozi. One rainy evening, while sitting alone outside the hospital room, Emeka suddenly remembered Ngozi's face the day she caught them together. The heartbreak in her voice where she whispered, "Amaka, you too," replayed painfully inside his head again and again. He finally lowered his head into his hands and cried quietly like a broken man. "I destroyed everything," he whispered painfully to himself. Meanwhile, news about Amaka's condition slowly reached Ngozi through Kelechi and Mama Uduaka. At first, Ngozi remained silent after hearing the news. She tried pretending it no longer mattered to her, but deep inside her heart still carried love for the little girl she raised like a daughter. That night, after Kelechi left her apartment, Ngozi sat alone quietly by the window while rain fell softly outside Lagos. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks despite everything Amaka had done. She remembered carrying her on her back through rain years ago. She remembered feeding her, protecting her, and praying for her survival. No matter how deep the betrayal became, part of Ngozi still could not stop loving her sister completely. Mama Uduaka later found Ngozi crying silently in the kitchen. "My daughter," the elderly woman said gently. Ngozi wiped her tears quickly and shook her head weakly. "Why do I still feel this pain for her after everything?" she whispered brokenly. Mama Uduaka sighed sadly and touched her shoulder softly. "Because your love for her was real." Days later, after leaving the hospital weak and emotionally shattered, Amaka could no longer bear the weight of her guilt and loneliness. Emeka had become emotionally distant and cold. The apartment itself now felt empty and cursed. Every mirror reminded her of the woman she had become. One rainy evening, wearing simple clothes without makeup or glamour, Amaka quietly entered a taxi and traveled across Lagos toward Ngozi's apartment. Her body still looked weak from the miscarriage, and her eyes remained swollen from endless crying. When she finally reached the building, she stood outside trembling badly for several minutes before knocking weakly on the door. Inside, Ngozi slowly opened the door, expecting perhaps Kelechi or Mama Uduaka. But the moment she saw Amaka standing there under the rain looking completely broken, she froze instantly. Gone was the proud woman who once walked confidently beside Emeka. The person standing there now looked shattered, weak and lost. Before Ngozi could even speak, Amaka suddenly dropped to her knees crying uncontrollably while holding Ngozi's legs tightly. "Sister Mama," she sobbed painfully while holding Ngozi's legs tightly. "Please forgive me, please." Ngozi remained frozen completely while tears slowly gathered in her eyes again. Amaka cried heavily, like a child drowning in regret. "I destroyed everything," she whispered through painful sobs. "I destroyed your life, and God punished me for it." The rain continued falling quietly outside, while Ngozi stood there speechless, staring down at the broken little sister she once carried on her back through storms many years ago, as tears slowly rolled down her own face too. The small apartment in Lagos remained quiet except for the soft sound of rain falling outside as Amaka sat weakly on Ngozi's couch with swollen eyes and trembling hands. Her body still looked fragile after the miscarriage complications, and the proud confidence she once carried had completely disappeared. She now looked like the same frightened little girl Ngozi raised after their parents died. Ngozi sat across from her silently, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold in her hands. For several long moments, neither of them spoke because too much pain already filled the room. Then, suddenly, Amaka broke down again completely. She slid from the couch onto the floor and crawled toward Ngozi, crying heavily. "Sister Mama, please forgive me," she sobbed painfully while holding Ngozi's legs tightly. "Please, I know I don't deserve it." Ngozi closed her eyes tightly as tears rolled down her own face because hearing that old name again shattered her heart deeply. Amaka cried uncontrollably like a child while speaking through broken sobs. "I became jealous of you," she admitted weakly. "At first, I tried fighting the feeling, but it kept growing inside me slowly." Ngozi stared down at her silently while tears continued falling. Amaka shook her head helplessly. "Everywhere we went, people praised you. They talked about your sacrifices, your goodness, your strength. I started feeling small beside you." Her voice trembled badly. "Then Emeka came into our lives and gave you everything we used to dream about together. The mansion, the peace, the love, and instead of being happy for you completely, I became bitter." Ngozi's lips trembled painfully after hearing those words. Amaka looked up at her with deep shame and regret filling her eyes. "I kept comparing myself to you," she confessed weakly. "You were respected, loved, admired, and I felt invisible." Her crying became heavier. "I started wanting your life until I destroyed it." Ngozi suddenly covered her face with both hands as painful sobs escaped her chest too. Hearing the truth from Amaka's own mouth reopened every wound inside her heart. "Why, Amaka? After everything we survived together, why would you hurt me like that?" Amaka buried her face against Ngozi's knees while crying like a child. "I was selfish. I was insecure. I allowed jealousy to poison my heart until I became someone terrible." Her body shook violently with regret. "You gave me your youth. You dropped out of school for me. You starved for me. And I repaid you by stealing the only happiness life finally gave you." The room became filled with the painful sound of both sisters crying together. Ngozi's mind drifted back to all the years she raised Amaka alone after their parents died. She remembered carrying her through heavy rain, washing her school uniforms late at night, selling akara before sunrise, and praying desperately not to fail her. Despite the betrayal, those memories refused to disappear from her heart. Slowly, finally, Ngozi bent down trembling and held Amaka tightly against her chest. The moment Amaka felt her sister's arms around her again, she cried even harder uncontrollably. "I am sorry," she kept repeating painfully. "I am sorry. I am sorry." Ngozi also cried heavily while hugging her. "You broke my heart, Amaka. You destroyed me completely." Amaka nodded weakly while crying. "I know." They remained holding each other tightly for a long time while years of love, pain, betrayal, regret, and grief poured out through tears. Finally, Ngozi slowly touched Amaka's face gently and whispered softly, "I forgive you." The words shattered Amaka emotionally. She stared in disbelief before bursting into fresh, painful sobs. "How can you still forgive me after everything?" she cried weakly. Ngozi smiled sadly through tears. "Because no matter what happened, you are still the little girl I promised our parents I would protect." Meanwhile, Emeka Daniels remained trapped in unbearable regret and loneliness. Since the miscarriage and collapse of everything, peace had completely disappeared from his life. He barely slept, avoided social gatherings, and constantly replayed the moment Ngozi caught them together. One evening, after hearing from Kelechi that Ngozi and Amaka had finally reconciled emotionally, Emeka gathered courage to visit Ngozi's apartment, hoping desperately for forgiveness too. When Ngozi opened the door and saw him standing there looking exhausted and ashamed, sadness immediately crossed her face. Emeka lowered his head weakly. "Please, can we talk?" he asked softly. Ngozi stepped outside quietly and closed the door behind her. Rain clouds covered the evening sky while silence hung painfully between them. Emeka looked at her with regret filling his eyes completely. "Ngozi, I know I don't deserve another chance," he whispered brokenly. "But please, I am begging you." Tears gathered in his eyes. "I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Ngozi remained silent while listening. Emeka moved slightly closer, desperately. "I still love you," he said weakly. "I made terrible mistakes, but I can change." Ngozi's eyes filled with tears immediately, but this time her voice remained calm and firm. "Some wounds never heal the same way again, Emeka," she whispered painfully. Emeka shook his head desperately. "Please don't give up on us." Ngozi looked directly into his eyes with quiet heartbreak. "You did not only betray me, you destroyed my trust completely. And once trust dies, love struggles to survive." Emeka lowered his head silently because deep inside he knew she was right. After he finally left, Ngozi returned inside slowly and found Amaka asleep weakly on the couch. Her face looked pale and tired even while sleeping. Over the following weeks, Amaka's health continued deteriorating quietly because of the miscarriage complications and emotional stress. Some days she became too weak to stand properly without help. Other nights she woke up crying from pain and nightmares. Despite everything that happened, Ngozi slowly began taking care of her again, lovingly, just like when they were younger. She cooked soft meals for her, gave her medicine carefully, cleaned her room, and stayed awake beside her during difficult nights. Sometimes, while helping Amaka drink medicine, painful memories returned to Ngozi of nursing her during childhood illnesses years ago. Mama Oduak watched them one afternoon and shook her head emotionally. "Ngozi, your heart is too pure," the elderly woman whispered. Ngozi smiled sadly while adjusting Amaka's blanket gently. "She's still my sister," she replied quietly. One late rainy night, after another exhausting day of weakness and emotional pain, Amaka lay beside Ngozi inside the small apartment while lantern light glowed softly across the room. The atmosphere felt calm and emotional. Amaka looked very weak as she slowly turned toward Ngozi with tears quietly gathering in her eyes again. Ngozi touched her forehead gently. "Are you feeling pain again?" she asked softly. Amaka shook her head weakly before whispering in a trembling voice, "Sister Mama." Ngozi looked at her carefully. Tears rolled slowly down Amaka's cheeks as she stared at Ngozi with deep love and regret. Then, in a weak, emotional voice, she whispered softly, "In my next life, I still want you to be my sister." Tears immediately filled Ngozi's eyes again as she stared silently at the broken little girl she once promised beside their parents' graves never to abandon. Life inside Ngozi's small apartment in Lagos became quieter and heavier as Amaka's condition slowly worsened day after day. Though the sisters had finally reconciled emotionally, the damage inside Amaka's body continued growing silently after the miscarriage complications. Some mornings, she woke up too weak to even stand properly. Other days, she struggled to breathe comfortably or eat without pain. Yet, despite everything, Ngozi refused abandoning her. Every morning, she helped Amaka sit up gently, prepared soft food carefully, gave her medication, and prayed beside her bed with tears hidden quietly in her eyes. Sometimes, while brushing Amaka's hair softly, Ngozi remembered the little girl she once raised after their parents died, and her heart broke all over again. One afternoon, while helping Amaka drink tea slowly, Ngozi noticed bloodstains again on the bedsheets and immediately panicked. "Amaka!" she cried fearfully while touching her forehead. Amaka tried forcing a weak smile. "I am fine," she whispered softly, but her voice already sounded too weak. Within minutes, Ngozi rushed her back to the hospital while rain clouds gathered heavily over Lagos once again. Inside the emergency ward, doctors moved quickly while Ngozi stood nearby, trembling with fear. After several examinations, Dr. Ibrahim finally walked toward Ngozi with a serious face that immediately made her heart sink painfully. "Her condition is getting worse," he explained carefully. "The internal damage is severe and her body is becoming weaker." Ngozi's eyes immediately filled with tears. "Please save my sister," she whispered brokenly. The doctor sighed softly. "We are trying our best." From that day onward, Amaka remained admitted permanently inside the hospital. Ngozi refused leaving her side for long, even when nurses advised her to rest. She slept on uncomfortable chairs beside the hospital bed, fed Amaka carefully with trembling hands, cleaned her face gently whenever she became too weak, and held her hand through every painful moment. Sometimes late at night, when Amaka slept briefly, Ngozi quietly cried alone inside hospital corridors while praying desperately to God not to take the little sister she fought so hard to protect all her life. Meanwhile, the emotional bond between both sisters slowly returned more deeply than ever before. Without pride, jealousy, or lies remaining between them anymore, they finally spoke honestly and lovingly again, like family healed through pain. One evening, while rain tapped softly against the hospital windows, Amaka looked weakly toward Ngozi and smiled faintly. "Do you remember when I got malaria as a child?" she asked softly. Ngozi smiled sadly through tears. "You almost refused taking medicine because it was bitter." Amaka laughed weakly despite the pain. "And you chased me around the room with a spoon." Both sisters laughed softly together for a moment before silence returned emotionally. Amaka stared at Ngozi quietly afterward. "You spent your whole life taking care of me," she whispered painfully. "Even after everything I did, you are still here." Ngozi squeezed her hand gently while tears filled her eyes again. "I could never stop being your sister," she replied softly. Meanwhile, Emeka Daniels also visited the hospital several times quietly, but Ngozi kept her distance emotionally. Though she no longer hated him with burning anger, the pain he caused remained too deep inside her heart. One afternoon, Emeka stood beside Amaka's bed while she slept weakly and finally broke down openly. "I destroyed this family," he whispered painfully, while tears rolled down his face. Ngozi looked at him silently before replying softly, "Some mistakes do not only hurt people, they change lives forever." Emeka lowered his head in shame because there was nothing left to defend anymore. As the days passed, Amaka's strength continued fading slowly. Nurses noticed it. Doctors noticed it. Even Amaka herself understood quietly that death was approaching. One calm night, after heavy rain finally stopped outside the hospital, the atmosphere inside the room became strangely peaceful. Ngozi sat beside Amaka's bed, holding her hand gently, while soft light from the hallway entered the room. Amaka looked extremely pale and weak, but her eyes remained calm for the first time in many months. Slowly, she turned toward Ngozi and whispered softly, "Sister Mama." Ngozi quickly leaned closer. "I am here." Amaka smiled faintly while tears gathered slowly in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered weakly. Ngozi's lips trembled immediately. "Don't talk too much," she said softly while trying not to cry again. But Amaka shook her head slowly. "Please, let me say this." Her voice became emotional and shaky. "After our parents died, nobody wanted us, but you stayed." Tears rolled down Ngozi's face quietly. Amaka continued weakly. "You loved me when life became hard. You protected me when nobody else cared." Her breathing became slower and weaker. "And after I destroyed your heart, you still loved me." Ngozi completely broke down crying beside the bed. "Please stop talking like this," she begged weakly while holding Amaka's hand tighter. But Amaka smiled softly again through tears. "You are the greatest blessing God gave me." Her eyes slowly became heavier as exhaustion overwhelmed her body. "I am sorry for every pain I caused." Ngozi cried uncontrollably now. "I forgave you already," she whispered repeatedly through tears. "I forgave you." Amaka looked at her one final time with deep love and regret inside her fading eyes. Then, in a weak, trembling voice, she whispered softly, "I love you, Sister Mama." Ngozi pressed Amaka's hand tightly against her face while crying heavily. "I love you too." A few moments later, while Ngozi was still holding her hand beside the hospital bed, Amaka's breathing slowly faded away peacefully into silence. At first, Ngozi stared at her in disbelief. Then realization crashed painfully into her heart. "Amaka," Ngozi whispered fearfully while shaking her hand gently. "Amaka." But there was no response anymore. Loud, painful cries escaped Ngozi's chest as she collapsed beside the bed, completely shattered emotionally. Nurses rushed into the room quickly while Ngozi continued crying uncontrollably over the little sister she loved despite everything. Days later, during Amaka's funeral, dark clouds covered the sky as mourners gathered silently around the graveside. Ngozi stood dressed in black with swollen eyes, while tears rolled quietly down her face throughout the burial. Mama Uduak and Kelechi supported her emotionally as she struggled to remain standing. From a distance, Emeka watched silently, filled with unbearable guilt and regret. He looked completely broken by everything that had happened, but Ngozi never returned to him. The wound between them remained too deep to heal the same way again. Months later, Ngozi slowly dedicated her life fully to helping abandoned women, struggling widows, and orphan girls across Lagos in memory of both her parents and Amaka. She created a small foundation where young girls without support could receive shelter, food, education, and love. One bright afternoon, Ngozi stood before a group of smiling orphan girls inside the foundation building, while sunlight entered warmly through the windows. Though pain still lived quietly inside her heart, she now carried purpose too. One little girl suddenly hugged her tightly and asked innocently, "Auntie Ngozi, why do you help people so much?" Ngozi smiled softly through emotional tears before answering gently, "Because sometimes the people who need love the most are the ones carrying the deepest pain." Then, after looking quietly at the girls surrounding her, she whispered softly with tears shining in her eyes, "Love carefully, because sometimes the deepest wounds come from the people we would die for." 5 years passed quietly after Amaka's death. And though the pain never disappeared completely from Ngozi's heart, life slowly taught her how to breathe again. Inside Lagos, the small foundation she started for abandoned women and orphan girls continued growing bigger every year. What began as a simple shelter inside a rented building slowly became a respected place where hurting women found safety, food, education, and hope again. Many people across Lagos now knew Ngozi as a strong woman with a soft heart who dedicated her life to helping others heal from pain. Some called her Mama Ngozi because of the way she cared for every child like her own. Though her smile had returned gradually over the years, deep sadness still lived quietly inside her eyes sometimes, especially during lonely nights when memories of her parents and Amaka returned painfully. Yet, instead of bitterness destroying her completely, Ngozi allowed her pain to become something useful for others. Every morning, she woke up early, prayed quietly beside the old photograph of her parents, and thanked God for giving her strength to survive everything life had thrown at her. One bright Saturday afternoon, the foundation organized a charity event for orphan girls and struggling widows. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and children running happily everywhere, while volunteers served food and distributed gifts. Ngozi moved around warmly, greeting guests and helping the children settle down. Though she now dressed more elegantly and carried herself with quiet confidence, humility still remained deeply inside her. As she arranged books on one of the tables, an elderly woman suddenly approached her, smiling warmly. "Ngozi," the woman said softly, "there is somebody I want you to meet." Ngozi looked up politely and saw a tall, calm-looking man standing nearby, dressed in a simple but expensive suit. He looked mature, maybe in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a peaceful face that carried hidden sadness too. "This is Dr. Michael Lawson," the elderly woman introduced warmly. "He recently returned from Canada and supports charity projects across Africa." The man smiled gently and stretched out his hand respectfully. "I have heard a lot about your work," he said calmly. Ngozi smiled politely while shaking his hand. "Thank you." Unknown to her, Michael had already spent months quietly following the foundation's work after hearing Ngozi's painful story from mutual church members. Unlike many people, he did not pity her. Instead, he admired her strength deeply. Throughout the event, Michael watched how lovingly Ngozi interacted with the girls, how patiently she listened to struggling women, and how naturally kindness flowed from her heart despite all the pain she had survived. Later that evening, while helping arrange leftover food packages, Michael walked toward her again quietly. "You built something beautiful from your pain," he said softly. Ngozi smiled faintly. "Pain can either destroy a person or teach them compassion." Michael nodded thoughtfully. Not everybody chooses compassion. Their conversation slowly continued over the following months. Unlike Emeka, Michael never rushed Ngozi emotionally. He respected her silence, listened carefully whenever she spoke, and never pressured her to open old wounds before she was ready. Ngozi eventually learned that Michael had once lost his wife and young daughter years earlier in an accident while living abroad. Since then, he dedicated most of his life to humanitarian work and medicine. Both of them carried scars life had carved deeply into their hearts, and slowly they found unexpected peace in each other's company. One evening, after closing activities at the foundation, Michael sat beside Ngozi quietly outside while children laughed nearby in the playground. "You still struggle to trust love again sometimes, don't you?" he asked gently. Ngozi remained silent briefly before answering honestly. "Some wounds change a person forever." Michael nodded softly. "I understand." Then, after a short silence, he added quietly, "But sometimes God sends healing through people we never expected." Those words stayed inside Ngozi's heart long after he left that evening. Slowly, over time, peace entered her life again in ways she never imagined possible. Michael treated her with patience, honesty, gentleness, and deep respect. Most importantly, he never tried replacing her painful memories or pretending her past never happened. Instead, he honored the woman she became because of her suffering. One afternoon, while visiting the graves of her parents and Amaka, quietly, Ngozi stood silently holding flowers, while tears filled her eyes again. Michael stood respectfully nearby without disturbing her grief. After placing the flowers down gently, Ngozi whispered softly toward the graves, "I survived." Tears rolled slowly down her cheeks, while Michael quietly held her hand supportively for the first time. 2 years later, inside a beautiful, peaceful church surrounded by smiling orphan girls from the foundation, Ngozi married Michael quietly in an emotional ceremony filled with healing instead of pain. This time, Ngozi did not cry from fear or heartbreak. She cried because after everything life stole from her, love still found her again, gently and honestly. During the reception, many women from the shelter openly cried while celebrating her happiness because Ngozi's life had become proof that betrayal and suffering do not always have the final answer. Years later, Ngozi's foundation became one of the most respected shelters for abandoned women and orphan girls across Lagos. Michael supported her dreams fully while continuing his medical charity work. Together, they built a peaceful, loving home filled with kindness, healing, and purpose. Eventually, God blessed Ngozi with twins, a boy and a girl. The day she held them inside the hospital, she cried uncontrollably while remembering the painful journey that brought her there. Michael gently touched her shoulder while smiling warmly. "What will we name them?" he asked softly. Ngozi looked lovingly at the babies resting peacefully in her arms before whispering emotionally, "They will carry my parents' names." Years later, one bright morning at the foundation, Ngozi stood before dozens of smiling young girls during a mentorship program. Some of the girls were once abandoned, abused, or rejected, just like Ngozi and Amaka once feared becoming after their parents died. As the children listened carefully, Ngozi smiled softly with tears shining quietly in her eyes. "Life will hurt you sometimes," she said gently. "The people you love most may disappoint you deeply, but never allow pain to turn your heart wicked." The girls listened silently while she continued softly. "Love carefully, because sometimes the deepest wounds come from the people we would die for. But also remember this: betrayal is not the end of your story. Healing is possible, and one day, life can still surprise you with peace again." The lesson in this story is that jealousy, betrayal, greed, and hidden bitterness can destroy even the deepest family love, while true sacrifice and genuine love should never be taken for granted because the people who love us sincerely are rare. And once trust is broken, the pain can leave wounds that may never fully heal, teaching us to protect our hearts, appreciate loyal people, avoid comparing our lives with others, and remember that selfish choices made in moments of temptation can ruin many lives forever. Thanks for watching this amazing story on African Stories by V. If you liked it and felt inspired, please show your support by clicking the like button, sharing with your friends, and leaving a comment below. To see more interesting stories and learn about different cultures, subscribe to African Stories by V, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories to you. Until we meet again, stay connected, stay inspired, and keep smiling.